A Spanish sailor stood on the deck of the galleon San Martin in late July 1588, watching the English coastline slide past in the gray channel light. He had served in the navy of the most powerful empire on earth. His ship was part of a fleet that Spain had spent 3 years and a fortune in silver assembling. 130 ships, over 18,000 soldiers and sailors, nearly 2,000 cannon. Nothing like it had ever sailed from a European port before. Across the water, watching from smaller, faster ships, were English sailors commanding a navy roughly half the size, funded by a treasury that was, by comparison, nearly empty. On paper, this should not have been close. Spain was the wealthiest nation in the world, fed by a river of silver flowing in from the Americas every year. England was an island kingdom with a fraction of that wealth, a fraction of that manpower, and no tradition of building a fleet this large. And yet within weeks, the greatest naval force Europe had ever assembled would be scattered, broken, and destroyed, not primarily by English guns, but by the very system that had made Spain unstoppable everywhere else. To understand how that happened, you have to understand what Spain was in 1588. By the late 16th century, Spain controlled an empire that stretched across 4 continents. Gold and silver from mines in Peru and Mexico crossed the Atlantic in fleets so large and so valuable that other nations built entire economic strategies around simply trying to rob them. Spain's army, the tercios, was considered the finest infantry force in Europe, a disciplined formation of pikemen and musketeers that had dominated European battlefields for nearly a century. Spanish diplomats sat in every major court. Spanish gold financed wars from the Netherlands to Italy. King Philip II ruled an empire so vast that it was said the sun never set on it. And Philip had a specific grievance with England. English privateers, operating with the quiet blessing of Queen Elizabeth, had spent years raiding Spanish treasure ships and Spanish ports in the Americas. England had also provided support to Protestant rebels fighting Spanish rule in the Netherlands. And there was religion. Philip saw himself as the defender of the Catholic Church against a Protestant queen he considered an illegitimate heretic. By 1586, he had made his decision. Spain would invade England, remove Elizabeth, and return the island to Catholic rule. The plan looked simple on a map in Madrid. In practice, it depended on a level of coordination that nothing in Spain's military experience had prepared it for. The Armada's mission was not actually to fight its way into London. The plan, designed largely by Philip himself, called for the fleet to sail up the English Channel, rendezvous with a separate Spanish army of 30,000 men stationed in the Netherlands under the Duke of Parma, and then escort that army across the narrow strait to invade England directly. It was an elegant plan on paper. It required 2 forces, separated by hundreds of miles and an ocean, to arrive at the same stretch of coastline at almost exactly the same time, with no reliable way to communicate between them once the fleet had sailed. Philip had built the most sophisticated navy Europe had ever seen. He had not built a system capable of adjusting that plan once it was in motion. The Armada's commander, the Duke of Medina Sidonia, reportedly protested his own appointment, writing to the king that he had no experience commanding a fleet and suffered from seasickness. Philip appointed him anyway, in part because Medina Sidonia was a nobleman of the correct rank and in part because the previous commander, an experienced admiral, had died suddenly months before the fleet sailed. The chain of command that would decide the fate of Spain's empire in the Channel was, from the very top, built more around social hierarchy than naval expertise. The fleet finally departed Lisbon in late May 1588, delayed for weeks by storms and supply problems that should have been a warning. It was forced back into the Spanish port of Corunna by bad weather almost immediately, costing another month of preparation and morale. When it finally entered the English Channel in late July, English scouts spotted it almost at once, and beacon fires lit along the English coast carried the warning inland within hours. This was the first thing Spain had not fully accounted for. England's home advantage was not simply geographic. It was informational. Every English captain in the Channel knew these waters intimately. Every Spanish captain was navigating largely blind, in a channel notorious for its currents, sandbars, and sudden storms. The 2 fleets first engaged off Plymouth on July 31st. What followed surprised both sides, though for different reasons. The Spanish ships were built for a different kind of war. Spain's naval doctrine, refined over decades of fighting in the Mediterranean and against lightly armed enemy vessels, was built around grappling and boarding. Spanish galleons carried large contingents of soldiers whose job was to close with an enemy ship, throw grappling hooks, and take it by force in hand-to-hand combat. It was a doctrine that had worked brilliantly against the ships Spain usually fought. The English had built something different. Under naval reformers like John Hawkins, England had spent years developing longer, lower, faster ships equipped with more numerous, longer-range cannon, designed explicitly to avoid close combat and instead pound an enemy from a distance. English captains understood this advantage and refused to let the Spanish close. Again and again over the following days, Spanish ships tried to maneuver into boarding range, and again the faster English vessels simply sailed away, firing from a distance the Spanish gunners struggled to match. It was not that Spanish sailors were incompetent. Individual Spanish crews fought with real skill and discipline throughout the campaign. The problem was structural. The entire fleet had been built, trained, and equipped for a fight the English refused to have. For over a week, the two fleets moved up the channel in a running battle that inflicted damage but produced no decisive result. The Spanish held their formation with impressive discipline, a tight defensive crescent that protected their most vulnerable ships. But every day spent in that formation, moving toward the rendezvous point off Calais, was a day the underlying plan drifted further from reality. When the Armada finally anchored off Calais on August 6th, it was in position to link up with Parma's army as planned. There was only one problem. Parma's army was not ready. The soldiers waiting in the Netherlands needed barges to cross the channel, and those barges required a deep water port to launch from safely. Parma did not have one available, and Dutch rebel ships, allied with England, were blockading the shallow ports he did control. The two halves of Philip's invasion plan, designed in a palace in Madrid without any real mechanism for real-time coordination, had arrived at the same moment in history and discovered they could not actually meet. That night, the English made their move. They loaded 8 old ships with pitch, tar, and gunpowder, set them ablaze, and sent them drifting directly into the anchored Spanish fleet. Fire ships were not a new tactic, and Spanish commanders had anticipated the possibility. But anticipating a tactic and having time to execute an orderly response to it are different things. In the panic and darkness, Spanish captains cut their anchor cables rather than risk being caught at anchor by burning ships, scattering the tight defensive formation that had protected the fleet for over a week. Few ships were actually destroyed by the fire ships themselves. The real damage was what came the next morning, at the Battle of Gravelines, when the English fleet fell upon a Spanish force that could no longer fight as a coordinated unit. Individual Spanish galleons, isolated from the formation that had been their main defense, took direct cannon fire for hours. Spanish losses that day were significant, though far from fleet-ending. But the battle accomplished something more important than sinking ships. It pushed the surviving Armada north, away from the Channel, away from Parma, away from any possibility of completing the invasion. The mission was over. What happened next killed more Spanish sailors than any English cannon had. With the Channel behind them and the wind against a return south, Medina Sidonia made the only decision available to him. He ordered the fleet to sail north around Scotland and Ireland to reach Spain, a route that would take his battered, undersupplied ships through some of the most dangerous waters in Europe during autumn storm season. Spanish charts of these waters were poor. Many ships had already taken damage in the Channel fighting that made them less seaworthy. Food and fresh water, calculated for a shorter campaign, ran critically low. As the fleet rounded the north of Scotland and came down the Irish coast, a series of brutal autumn storms tore through the already weakened ships. Dozens wrecked directly on the Irish coastline. Historians estimate that of the roughly 130 ships that had sailed from Lisbon, only about 60 returned to Spain, and many of those arrived in ruins, their crews decimated by starvation, disease, and drowning. Estimates of total Spanish losses run as high as 15,000 men. The overwhelming majority lost not in battle, but to the sea itself, in a disaster that Philip's own naval doctrine had left the fleet unprepared to survive. Here is the question historians have debated for over 4 centuries. Spain did not lose because its ships were badly built or its sailors were cowards. Ship for ship, the Spanish galleons were formidable vessels, and Spanish crews fought the running battle up the Channel with real courage under difficult circumstances. Spain's navy had a century of institutional success behind it, built on a doctrine of grappling and boarding that had won it dominance in the Mediterranean and control of shipping lanes across 2 oceans. That doctrine was not wrong. It had simply been built for a different kind of enemy, in different waters, against ships that did not exist yet when Spain first developed it. England, by contrast, had spent years deliberately building ships and tactics around avoiding the exact kind of fight Spain was best at. The Armada's defeat was not a single mistake. It was the accumulated result of a system so confident in its own proven methods that it never seriously questioned whether those methods still applied to the specific fight in front of it. The deeper failure sat above the water, in the plan itself. Philip II designed an invasion that required two separate forces, an armada and an army, to synchronize a link-up across open water with no reliable communication once the operation began. This was not a small oversight. It was the central assumption the entire campaign depended on, and it had never been realistically tested before the fleet sailed. Philip had built an empire on the logic of central authority, decisions made in Madrid and carried out faithfully across an empire that spanned the globe. That system worked when it came to administering colonies and managing trade. It broke down completely when applied to a military operation that required flexible, real-time coordination between commanders separated by hundreds of miles of unpredictable sea. Medina Sidonia, waiting off Calais for an army that could not come, had no authority to improvise a new plan. His orders were to rendezvous with Parma. When that became impossible, the entire operation had no fallback, because no one in Madrid had planned for the possibility that the plan itself might fail. There is a pattern here that extends well beyond naval history. An organization builds a method that produces real, repeated success. That success becomes doctrine. Doctrine becomes identity. And identity becomes something the organization stops examining. Because examining it would mean questioning the very thing that made it powerful in the first place. Spain's grappling and boarding navy had won for a century. Its success was not an accident, and abandoning it was not obvious, especially to commanders who had built their careers inside that system. The same pattern shows up again and again outside of warfare. A retailer that dominates through physical stores and an efficient supply chain can find itself unable to seriously invest in a different kind of commerce, not because its leadership lacks intelligence, but because every incentive inside the organization rewards doubling down on what already works. A film company that built an empire on physical distribution can watch a digital alternative emerge and treat it as a minor threat rather than an existential one, because the existing system has no internal mechanism for taking a fundamentally different model seriously until it is too late. The pattern is always the same. Success entrenches a method. The method becomes invisible, treated not as one option among many, but as simply how things are done. And when the environment shifts, the organization's greatest historical strength becomes the exact reason it cannot adapt quickly enough to survive the shift. The Spanish Armada did not fail because Spain was weak. It failed because Spain had built the most refined version of a very specific kind of power, at the exact moment history required a different kind. Philip II had more ships, more soldiers, more money, and more territory than England could ever hope to match. None of that mattered in the Channel in the summer of 1588, because the fight that actually took place was not the fight Spain had spent a century preparing for. England did not need to be stronger than Spain. It only needed to force a different kind of contest, one where Spain's advantages became irrelevant and its blind spots became decisive. The Armada sailed north around Scotland not as a retreat, but as a disaster already in motion, a fleet destroyed less by an enemy than by a plan that had never seriously considered what would happen if the plan did not work exactly as designed. Spain would remain a great power for decades after 1588. But the myth of Spanish invincibility at sea, the assumption that had shaped a century of Spanish strategy, was gone the moment the first fire ship drifted into the anchorage at Calais, and it never fully returned.